Okay, the last 20-25 minutes is question time. Question time. So, if you have any questions, shoot.
What would you suggest for having a base for analog synthesizer, for example, for absolute beginners? So, what kind of box, or I assume that there are multiple architectures, and what would you suggest? What architectures should we use?
Well, in general, because there's of course a lot of stuff out there for sale. In general, you would have to go to a shop like Stuyvesant, and then they should be sort of able to suggest something to you. But if it would be one of my systems, what I would suggest is that basically the way I set it up is that you see you have these panels. Basically, this system has 4 panels. So if you want to have a system, what you need is you need a case, and you need a mounting frame, and a power supply, and some of the stuff that's in there. And then you could basically start with only one panel, because like this panel here is already sort of like a very simple baseline synthesizer. You can do a very good bass with it. I come from the Netherlands, and there's a large dense producer scene in the Netherlands, and there are quite a few there that use just one panel only for their bass.
And this panel, what kind of modules does it include?
It basically has one oscillator, one envelope generator, and one 24 dB filter. And it's a little bit like how I demonstrated it when I started. So all that you would need for that is you connect it to an output, and you have to connect an analog keyboard. But there's, at the moment, and that's quite nice, there's a lot of really cheap stuff, like I think this little Arturia bass step thing cost me 95 euros, and it actually has analog outputs for to connect to an analog synthesizer. So you don't have to.
Meaning that it gives out voltage between the minus and 10 volts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the box itself, like okay, there's this one module, and I saw that you have a module on the bottom that is able to generate just a signal, static voltage. I don't know.
Yeah, the thing is, of course, like you were asking, like the sort of like the absolute minimum.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, if you would just have this panel, then basically you are able to sort of sequence very simple. You can change to so for many guys that only need a bass line, they say, oh, this is already enough for me. I can do a very convincing sort of a minimo kind of bass line, and that's fine. So then basically, if you want to have more, then you could also opt for having a system with, so basically you could have a case like this with only one panel and 3 blank panels, and then expand later. So that is a possibility. And I must say that you know, if you suitcase like this complete is about 4,700 euros, so that's a stiff price for many people. So, but if you only start with 1 or 2 or 3 panels, you know, you can always expand later and get more and more and more functions. Does that answer your question a little bit?
And what's the price for this minimum setup?
Well, basically that would set you back by some 1,500 euros. So that's the start. But it basically, I would say you would only sort of do that if you want to expand it later and finally end up with a complete system after 2 or 3 years, because then it's really worth it. And if you, because the case and the power supply and the frame, etc., that's already like 500 euro in the price. So there's also many stuff that you can buy for 300-400 euro that also can do a baseline, and that's it. But then you cannot expand like the Dave Smith MoPro or something like that. So.
And then, for example, would it be also possible to make custom modules? I mean, maybe you sell parts, components that people can reuse in their custom thing?
No, not really, because I all this is hand built. I do everything myself. I make these front panels myself. I make the PCBs myself. Everything except the case, because the case somebody else, the company makes for me. But the rest is all do it yourself. Basically, do it myself. And of course, I have some method of doing that, a production method that sort of makes everything go smooth. And that is not, I cannot just sort of 1 to 3 change that to sort of like a kit version. So what I do is I make complete instruments for musicians, and I want to keep it to that. So sorry, no kits.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you maybe describe all the modules? Like describe the basic
Okay.
one.
Yeah.
Just to know what's in there.
Yeah, I just get the cables out so we have a little bit more overview, and then I just give a verbal description without demonstrating everything, because else it will be tomorrow 6 o'clock before we're finished. Basically, there is 2 different kind of voice panels. One voice panel has an oscillator, an envelope, and a 24 dB filter. The other has an oscillator, an envelope, and a so-called twin peak filter, which is a filter that can be used as both as basically 2 independent 18 dB low pass filters, but also as a 36 dB band pass filter. So very, very, very narrow. You can set it to very narrow width, and it also has a very good ping characteristic, the twin peak. So the twin peak filter is more useful for if you're in the somewhat more experimental electronic music thing, and the 24 dB is more useful if you're in a more traditional kind of, or maybe more poppy kind of music. So then, of course, you need an LFO to modulate stuff. So there's a module that contains 3 different types of LFOs. One LFO is a very simple triangle wave, sort of bread and butter kind of LFO that you would find in any system. One is basically, it gives a pulse of a certain width, and you can change the pulse width without changing the rate. And that also gives a unipolar output, where basically the triangle wave, the upslope and the downslope follow this pulse width. So that is more like a rhythm source. And you can also sync that one and restart it. And the third LFO is, it's a LFO that can basically, okay, I will very shortly demonstrate that, because I can do that quickly, I think, just like this. And control the level, let's see, in the stereo. that goes from very low rate up to a relatively high audio rate, but you can see from the LED now that this is the lowest rate. But this one has some interesting modulation possibilities. For instance, you can sweep the frequency from the third oscillator, but it also has another sort of modulation that modulates both the frequency and the amplitude at the same time, and that is sort of like can give you nice theremin kind of sounds. But the idea of having this one in the system as well is because you can use this very well to modulate like an oscillator or a filter from a low LFO rate up into a high audio rate. So they are all very different and they serve different purposes, but it's nice that they are in one module because you can just choose what you want. Then you always need to route signals, meaning that you have to get signals from one place to another. And mostly you'll find a thing that's called a multiple, which is basically just 3, 4 or 5 connectors in a row that are just soldered together, so you can put one signal in and sort of get 3 or 4 cables distributed to 3 or 4 cables. And basically this is a little bit like a multiple, like you have an input, and that input is basically available on 4 outputs. So you have sort of like 6 multiples. But it's a little bit more than that, because these connectors here are actually stereo connectors. And so if I want to listen to the output here, I can just listen to it, and basically I hear it at full strength. But if I put my cable here, all the ring signals on the stereo connectors are connected to a 6-channel mixer with its output here. And so if I use a stereo cable, then the output signal is on the tip and the input signal is on the ring, and I can actually either use a foot pedal or I can use something which I call a node proc, because these are nodes and the node processors. So if I put the stereo cable in here, I can actually now insert a VCA. And and because it's a VCA, I can modulate it from another source. I can, for instance, modulate it from an oscillator. I can set it to 0, but then when I open the modulation, I can actually go from a slow modulation up to an audio. But it also works the other way around, because the ring modulator is basically symmetrical. I can also easy way create effects with it as well. And so basically this is called a matrix, because now we can actually connect any input to any output, and if you connect more of these on this line, they will all add together to this output, so you have more than just a multiple. It's also a signal mixer. But it's not only a signal mixer, you can actually sort of define what sort of processing you want to have in that mix. So to start with, it's very simple. You can use it in a very simple way, but you can make it more and more elaborate and just to fit certain purposes. With these, so because this is basically working exactly the same way as an insert connector on a mixing desk, you can use what they call a T cable or a I cable or a split cable with one stereo connector at one side and two mono connectors at another side. If you put the stereo connector instead of this and you have the two mono plugs here, you can plug them into a volume pedal, into an effects pedal, but you can also put them into an input and an output of a filter and then quickly sort of insert a filter or something else in that point. So you have basically it's very flexible. I added a couple of sort of processors to use this. So what you have is you have a note quantizer, and that means that, for instance, if you just have a simple pitch and you want to create a scale, you can actually take like a LFO signal, insert it here, and you have different scales. You can make it wider. It goes from 10 octaves, because whatever is 1 volt octave is always also going negative. I don't like this stuff that only works between 0 and 5 volts, which you find on many Eurorack stuff. You also want to go deep. So, and you can go really fast. Kind of scales. Okay, but you can also use it in another way, because I have a knob here that basically only gives a voltage, either a negative or a positive voltage. And the quantizer has a transpose input, which is basically a 1 volt octave input. If you connect it to a 1 volt octave keyboard, you could transpose with the keyboard your quantizer up and down. But you can also, and I need another stereo cable for this, just take a 0 voltage and use this 0 voltage on this voltage knob, which is called the offset, and now I can actually and then put the, let's see what I'm doing here. Yeah, I put the output in here, and I can very easily sort of
jazz it out.
If you connect a ribbon controller to this, you're instantly in business. Okay. There is a gain pot, and basically what that does is, if you have an external signal which is line level, which is much lower than the signal levels that normally go on in the synthesizer, you can actually boost it by 20 dB to get it up to basically synth level. So if you would, for instance, use, actually I sort of matched it to Boss pedals, to the Boss effect pedals, because there's a couple of Boss pedals I like very much myself. They're somewhat older than the newest ones they have, and but they sort of work the same, like most pedals and effects machines work the same. So basically, if you want to sort of use an effect, you would go from a module into the effect, then you have to set the effect input level so the effect doesn't distort, doesn't clip, And then the output level is mostly much too low to be processed by the synthesizer. But then you can use this gain pot to actually crank it up to the normal level again, and so you can use whatever is there in the pedal world, and there's a lot out there in the pedal world. Then there are also two VCAs, but these VCAs are basically, they are basically bipolar. And that means that they can modulate in a positive direction, but they can actually also invert the signal. And that can sometimes be quite interesting, because I give a very simple example. For instance, if I have an oscillator, and I want to apply an envelope on the oscillator output, what I can do is I can use this this VCA. I can also use the VCA in the filter, but let's use this VCA. And basically, I have to open this one. I can open it here, but I can also open it the other way, and then actually the signal is inverted. So that means that if I modulate it now with an audio rate, you actually get that ring modulator effect that I just previously demonstrated. But if you now take an envelope generator, and let's say I just sort of put the envelope generator in repeat mode so it makes its own envelope. And then let's just say we have sort of like a standard envelope. And I modulate the VCA. Then you have the choice of sort of having like a minimal level, and modulate this, but I can actually also go negative, and what then happens is a quite interesting effect. Echo machine. Because what happens there is that basically your signal is quiet, it comes up, it becomes quiet again, but then it comes up again, but in inverse phase. But just a little bit. And then it goes up again. And because this is an inverse phase, our mind thinks, hey, it comes from another direction. Must be an echo. Just very simple psychoacoustic effect. But actually quite effective. And also depends a lot on, and if you go even further, you basically start to invert the envelope. So you could even add a slow LFO signal to this envelope signal before you apply it here, and then you would sort of like getting a envelope, reversed envelope, envelope, reversed envelope, and in that way sort of create a sense of motion in a drone or a sequence. Okay. 2 more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Oh shit.
Why not?
Yeah, okay, then we have a dual fader, and a dual fader is basically a voltage controlled mixer. You can use it either as a crossfader, you can use it as a panner, or you can use it as a ducker, and basically you have 2 of those. If you make a crossfader then, or a panner, then, and you mix 2 signals of different frequencies, if you're in the middle position, it's not that the level of the 2 inputs should both be 50%. Actually, they should be more like 70%. And that is, they call that root mean square mixing, or equal loudness switching, and that has to do with the fact that we actually act with waveforms, and if waveforms have different frequencies, then it's not just like you add them up like that. Some very complex mathematics comes into place. So if you have a voltage controlled mixer, you actually have to sort of take care that you have this correct curves, and these all have the correct curves for that. So that if you voltage control crossfade between us two differently tuned oscillators, it always sounds at the same level. If you would look on a measurement device, you would actually see that the level changes, but our mind, our ear, hears them at the same level. The good thing about crossfade mixing is that actually you can mix two signals with only one knob, and it never becomes silent. And that is good in a synthesizer, because mostly you have a VCA at the end. And if you have a mixer where you have like 3 channels and 3 knobs for the channels, then there is a situation where everything is silent, because when these 3 knobs are closed, and then you listen to the VCA output and you say, hey, I hear nothing, what's happening? Yeah, but with a crossfade mixing, actually that never happens. You always have an output signal at the end of your mixing. You can do some more tricks with it, but we don't have time for that. Then we have a Waveshaper, which is a little bit like what you call the West Coast Buchla style, Serge style Waveshaper, and a phaser, 8-pole phaser. But the phaser is a very wide range phaser. It phases over sort of 14 octaves, and you can modulate it at audio rate, which gives very nice FM effects. But as I have only 10 seconds left, I only have time to say that I also have something which I call a Rungler module, which is basically sort of like you can use it as the noise module, but it can also do all sorts of stepped patterns and random, semi-random kind of stuff. And now my 10 seconds are gone, and the word is to Richard. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we have to rush, but we have to set the concert.